Good afternoon to you all and welcome. My name is Michael Charles and I'm the Chief Executive of Sinclairslaw, a firm operating from London and Cardiff and therefore serving people throughout England and Wales. I'm also a solicitor specialising in education law, and some of you will know me, of course, and I've thoroughly enjoyed doing this over the years. I'm joined by my colleague, Chris Barnett, an associate solicitor here at Sinclairslaw. Some of you also will recall him. He's definitely one of the great stars in the legal world these days. Chris, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Mike, and everyone out there.
We would like also to welcome you to this, our third in the series of seminars designed to support people during the COVID-19 crisis. We've already done a seminar, as you probably will know, covering the Coronavirus Act and the legal restrictions that exist during this period, as well as, of course, the impact that this is all having on examinations these days. But this seminar is going to be something quite different. It's going to focus a bit more on the practical ramifications of the COVID-19. And so it's going to be somewhat different. We'll be having a discussion with a wonderful team of some of the leading experts in special needs practice, as well as, of course, the law. And the discussion is designed to address many of the questions that you were presented via my Facebook page, as well as queries that have been raised directly to the firm over the last few weeks. And the topics we are going to cover, therefore, will include a number of interesting things: children in isolation and how we will be supporting them during this particularly difficult time, and how to prepare them for transition back to school. And of course, many may be realizing during this time the full extent of the problems or strengths that their child may in fact be having. So a lot of these parents will be educating their children at home at the moment, and we'll be looking also at the potential problems and the frustration and the lapses perhaps in performance academically and socially. And what about child assessments during the lockdown period, and how can we really perform an OT, a speech language therapy assessment, or an educational psychology assessment during this time? And of course, last but not least, we'll be dealing with the legal problems and including some of the advantages in preparing for a tribunal during this period. And we also hope to deal with as many of your questions, but please understand that as you would expect, this should not really be interpreted as a specific legal professional advice, and it should never be used as a substitute for individual specific legal advice. And we would you would need in no circumstances to be seen, really. And this service is really an information gathering service, and we'd like to give you what we can, the best advice we can, but really it's not a substitute for proper legal and professional advice. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome you to my guests. I'm joined by Vivian Clifford. She is a well-known independent educational psychologist, and she has a very impressive curriculum vitae describing her experience in both the public and private sector. She's also a professional tutor at University College London on the Master's Programme for Educational Psychology. She has been involved in a number of publications and has worked for over 10 years with me, I think, in many of these special needs cases. And Viv, a very warm welcome to you this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Melinda Erickson is a London-based occupational therapist. She is frequently instructed to appear in the Special Needs and Disability Tribunal, and her specialist field is the inclusion of children and young people with special needs in their educational settings, as well as improving functional skills within their community and home life. Melinda, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
Juanita Hurley is regarded as one of the top speech and language therapists in the country. She's in very, very high demand and has masses of experience working in schools, as well as providing support to parents who are battling through the tribunal system. She's also a dear friend. Juanita, good afternoon to you. I don't think I heard that. Maybe it's my Rita, sorry, could I just test that? I didn't hear you. No, can any other guests hear Juanita? No, we're all shaking our heads. There's a microphone issue. Whether or not someone in technical support will be able to help with that. So hopefully we'll resolve that shortly. So sorry about that, but I'd just like to introduce you to Juanita. I haven't been able to do so. You can see her there, but hopefully her microphone will be sorted out shortly. Juanita, you might need to check your settings. We have the pleasure also of being joined by Charlotte Hadfield, the go-to barrister, I always call her, who many of you recall from the last 2 seminars. She's been a great friend of ours. She works from 3 paper buildings, and I'm delighted she's taken even more of her time today to help us. Charlotte, a very good afternoon to you.
Hello, Mike.
I'm really thrilled to introduce a wonderful friend, David Lawson, who is without doubt, like Charlotte, one of the best public law barristers, in my view, in the country today. And if you don't believe me, look him up on the Chamber's directory, where he is described as absolutely outstanding. Well, I know that because he paid me to say it. David, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Mike.
Well, the issues, of course, that we're going to be dealing with, children in isolation. So I'm not sure yet, before I just delve into it, I was wondering whether Juanita's speaker is working now. We need to retry you again. No, not sure about that. So I'm not sure if my technical support is available to help on that, but regrettably, it's a technical problem. I'm very sorry about that. We'll do what we can, and if we can resolve it, and if Dan in technical support can resolve it for her, I'll be very grateful. But we'll see what we can do. But the children in isolation, really, and that's the first thing. I mean, many parents, you can imagine, will be at home educating their children themselves, and parents might even question, perhaps really what the school was saying about the child's progress. Is it really exactly what the school said? I mean, Viv, do you think that that's the kind of thing that people might be picking up these days? The school have said, oh, my child's doing so well, but yet it turns out the child's not doing so well, according to parents, not reading as well. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's probably all sorts of things going through parents' heads at the moment as they come to terms with being teachers. A lot of the feedback that you hear from parents is what a wonderful job the teachers are actually doing, and what a hard job that they have. And I think, like so many things that this situation has thrown up, we're all rather more appreciative of each other than I think we were beforehand. However, there will certainly be some parents who are starting to realise perhaps the extent of some of the difficulties their children are having, which may range from even at the point of engaging them with work, getting them to be able to sit down and start to focus on the tasks and maintain that focus. And of course, if you have a child who may have an attention deficit, then the implications, the extent of that difficulty may be becoming very apparent. Parents might have been aware of it through the behaviour presentation of their child, but now they'll be seeing the impact of that when their child is trying to engage with learning activities and remain focused upon them. Some parents will be realising the difficulties their child may be having in just accessing the written language of the activities that teachers are sending home, and perhaps seeing some of the emotional fallout as well, if they weren't already seeing it, on the part of children who actually struggle enormously.
We often see, don't we? We often see, don't we, Viv, that schools will say, for example, that, or vice versa, it's the same thing. Child's fine at school, no problems at all, but hell breaks loose back at home. A typical trend that you often see, and it often is sometimes in vice versa, but generally the other way round. I mean, the point that I think is being made by many people who've been reporting to us in the last few weeks is that we're starting to, they're questioning more about what the schools are actually saying about the progress that their child has made. They said that they can do, I'm just being hypothetical, the alphabet or the times table, 2s, 3s and 4s. And yet it turned out when they're working with their parents at home, now there's so much time that they're being spent with, that's being spent with the children, that they're not actually doing as well as the school was saying. And it might lead to more. Do you think that might lead to more, people requesting extra help, perhaps from when they go back to school? Perhaps that might be something we'll see.
Well, I think certainly what we're going to see is parents wanting to have teacher-parent consultations where they take their observations back to the teachers and want additional information because there might be that disparity between what they've been told by the teacher and what they've actually seen as parents. And I would suggest that you remain confident in what you've seen. There might be the argument put to parents that they're not teachers and that maybe they weren't presenting things like phonics and literacy teaching in the way that the child is used to. But I would say to the parents, well, you've observed your child, you've seen their reactions, remain confident with that, make a list of the things that you've observed and are concerned about, and go get that parent-teacher consultation and have a full discussion about it.
Viv, another quite common thing that's being raised is, what about children who are anxious of attending school in the best of times? I mean, what impact do you think this will have on children who really might need particular support going back to school, you know, or the contemplation of going back to school, not necessarily in the next few weeks? It's possible, of course, we will not be seeing them back until September even, who knows? Tanya, for example, raised the question. She says that her child was not supported and became near suicidal when at school. And what really can be done to persuade the local authority in that instance to do something in particular for her? So, I mean, this is the common theme.
Sadly, yeah, sadly, that's an extreme example, but it is the reality for some parents and their children, and they will be going through that. I think one thing that parents can do is to note the differences that they've seen in their child after this period of staying at home. They may notice that their child is starting to recover a little bit from those signs of anxiety, that they might be more emotional balanced, that symptoms might be decreasing, they might be sleeping better, etc. Their moods may be better regulated, less volatile. They should make a log of those changes of what they're able to see. And also, if their child does go back to school, the differences that they then observe then, because that is really good evidence as to the emotional impact of the school on their child.
Melinda, I mean, another person, Rebecca, she says, what really can be realistically done for people who might need education otherwise than at school during this period? I mean, you know, there's lots of children who are currently at home who wouldn't ordinarily have had access to speech, occupational therapy, educational psychology intervention and specialist teaching intervention. What do you think this is likely to have in terms of, or the impact is likely to have for children who are actually at home at the moment? I mean, how difficult is it going to be, for example, for OT intervention to be delivered?
Well, from my experience so far, it hasn't been difficult to implement OT over video, Zoom, and other types of video access. So really, it's about upskilling parents, helping parents to be able to support their children. I think parents often have a very good understanding of their children's needs, but being able to identify when they might need some types of sensory input, how to break down tasks, especially when parents are trying to teach their children, breaking down those tasks and making them achievable. The same as what Viv has actually said, just about learning how their children learns, being able to take that back to school and discuss their child in a less stressful environment, what's actually worked for them.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, the other thing that I think some people have been raising in questions and emails, I've had an email this week from a gentleman called Christopher. He says that he's found for the first time since his child's been at home, he's revealed his child, his 10-year-old child, has revealed that the child's just sort of opened up and told them all about the horrible experiences that they've had, you know, the bullying, the terrible trauma, and all this came like a tsunami out. And he's saying, really, what can I do about that? I mean, Viv, maybe you have some thoughts about how a child could be supported emotionally during what is clearly a very, very distressing period for us all at the moment. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, that's a really sad thing to hear, and very distressful for the parent. I think first of all, your child needs reassurance, which I'm sure you're giving. They need to feel safe, they need to feel believed, and then you can sit down and you can start to have a conversation with the child about ways forward and plan together what will happen next. What you must be the primary thing that you do is that you go to the school and you tell them what the child has disclosed, and you work with them about what's going to happen when your child re-enters the school. You need to get hold of a copy of their bullying policy, and you need that school to reassure you that they believe your child, that they can look into things, and they will put safeguarding action into place so that your child is safe when they go back into school. And I wouldn't let up on it until you're completely satisfied.
Another common issue, I mean, I suppose that, you know, in, for example, Wales, they have limits to the amount of time that a child might access, I say child, an adult above the age of 18 might access support post school, and the limits that the Welsh government have placed is 2 years support, and there's a lot of people who are very worried about this lockdown period that's going to be extended, and potentially this sort of need for children. You often see children and adults generalizing skills across contexts, not merely just simply what they learn in the classroom, not being really able in the current climate to be able to demonstrate the generalization of skills in different contexts, because they can't go out. You can't go down the local shop and demonstrate that. And so there's a huge fear that they're missing out so much. Do you think that this is going to have an impact, Viv, on those groups of individuals who would need to demonstrate not just simply attainments, academic attainments, but attainments in regard to life and independent living skills generally?
I'm sure it will, and the extent of that will depend on the child's needs. So for some young people who might have really good social intent and a certain level of skill, they might be making use of social media, for example, to keep their social interaction going with established friends, and keep communication going. On the other hand, you may have young people with autism, and I know a number who are likely to remain within their rooms, which they will have set up with everything that they like to engage in on a repetitive basis, where they will have less stimulation in terms of social communication. They will fall back into very fixed routines and behaviours. They may lose some of that flexibility that was being developed, and will need help to make that transition back to their colleges or wherever they were. For them and the parents, that might be a real struggle, because, as we know, particularly young people with autism, and depending on the extent of that, when behaviours get sort of fixed, it can be difficult to actually help that person move out of that pattern, to transition out of what makes them feel comfortable and safe. So I'm sure that's going to be a real issue for some parents.
Melinda, you'll see it, for example, that young people who need to develop not necessarily, you know, GCSE qualifications, but developing good independent living skills, brushing their teeth and travel training and that kind of support. Do you envisage that this is going to be a real problem for specialist colleges during this time, of how to develop those kind of skills?
Do you mean for children who are at home?
Yeah, during the time when they're at home.
Yeah, so actually, I think this might be a really good opportunity, because we're not having to rush to get out the door. If we're going to go and get ready in the morning, they don't have to get a taxi to school or get a bus to school. So parents may have a little more time to break tasks down, to have the patience and not feel rushed and do these tasks for their children. I mean, I'm finding being able to go out without any traffic on the road, teaching my own children skills about riding safely on the road. So crossing the road without the visual distraction of a lot of traffic or a lot of noise that really upsets some children from a sensory perspective. Actually, there's an enormous amount of positivities that we can take out of this.
Yeah, no, I can see that, but I'm thinking about the amount of time that, I mean, you won't be able to do travel training, for example. You won't necessarily be able to do those kind of things, and the general kind of independent skills that you would see in the community, or you want them to develop in the community, that's going to be very difficult during this time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Community skills will be difficult, but you know, there's plenty of skills that young people and children need to develop at home, and we can do baking, and we can do eating, we can do dressing. We just need to be creative and find what we can do, because then when we go back to school, well, maybe the child doesn't find it so stressful to get dressed.
Yeah, it has. So shall I get off the phone then? Because otherwise,
I think Juanita's back. She's just, Juanita's with us. Juanita, are you can you hear me?
okay.
We have Juanita. That's great news. Sorry, we were just talking. I was just
all.
well, lovely to see you, Juanita, at last.
And great to be here. Thank you.
I hope it wasn't such a technical issue, was it? It wasn't too complex.
Oh, we've just swapped laptops. We're okay now.
Perfect. We were talking to both Viv and Melinda regarding the amount of support or skills that could be lost during this lockdown period, for particularly young people who need to acquire very key independent living kind of skills, you know, life skills, independent skills, that kind of thing. And during this period, they're not really going to be able to demonstrate the generalization of skills so easily, and not be able to measure it so easily. I mean, one of the key questions that's coming through for so many people, and they're saying the same thing really. I mean, Fee, for example, says, what can be done by a speech therapist and an occupational therapist, and maybe Melinda and Juanita, you can talk among yourselves about that, during this very difficult time at home. And Melinda's talked about some of that, but what can be done speech therapy-wise, Juanita?
Well, I think that, again, it's always going to vary dependent upon the needs of the individual child or young person. But there will have been programmes, there will have been targets set when the child or young person was in school. And I think that all parents can do is their absolute best to try to work to some of those targets, so that we are continuing to plug away at the same things. I would have hoped that elements of any speech and language therapy program will have made their way into the home in any event, so that we can tackle that thorny issue of generalization. So there will always be something that can be worked on, perhaps not as exhaustively as it would be within the school context, but you know, I think we've got to be a little bit creative and look to see how we can continue to support vocabulary within a home setting, how we can work on receptive understanding, expressive language, and there are always differing ways. There are lots of online programs that parents can download if that's what they choose to do. There's a lot of telehealth therapy that's going on, and the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists has a website that will inform parents where they can link up with a telehealth therapist if they feel that's what they want to do. So there is an awful lot of information out there, but I would always advise in the first instance that they went back to the programme that was specifically set for their child.
Linda, it's going to be very difficult, isn't it, though, to do certain therapies? I mean, we were talking yesterday about sensory integration therapy, for example. I mean, is there anything that you can advise a parent to do for a child with sensory issues? What they could make, I mean, obviously you're not going to be able to assess them during this so easily at this time, but what can a parent do you think, to help a child who has sensory issues but yet isolated in the home at the moment? Maybe help manage that. Is there anything you could advise?
I think that primarily if they have contact with an occupational therapist, then they really do need to speak to them, because every child's profile is just so different, and there are beyond thousands of websites that people can look at, and it's incredibly overwhelming. But I think at this time, we've got a lot of dysregulation, a lot of children feeling anxious and disorganized. And in those times, deep pressure, calming and organizing input is really one thing that is probably going to help most children. So if parents can do things like, if they can afford to buy something like a hammock that attaches to a pull-up bar in a doorway, if their child's small enough for that, if they can build dens, if they can work on giving their child avenues to crash onto a sofa, something that might not be allowed in normal times. That deep proprioceptive input is the most calming type of input, but every child is an individual, so you really do need to speak with an OT, or as Juanita said, go back to your OT reports, go back to your programs, find what your children's primary need is. And I understand there is going to be a list of resources provided at some point that parents can reference, and I'll put on there that some sensory sites that I think give really good information rather than parents feeling overwhelmed.
Great. I think we should go on to talk about assessments. I mean, with a view to education, healthcare assessments and statutory assessments. I mean, some experts are refusing to undertake remote assessments. I mean, for example, I had one today, believe it or not, this morning, who wrote to say that, I'm just looking back at the email, what they said is that it is simply not possible to do a proper IQ assessment by a remote method. Viv, you've got any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, there's more to an assessment than doing an IQ test. We must be very clear about that. And a lot of people listening to this, and perhaps your clients, will have issues around a range of things far beyond just an IQ, which is kind of a measure of cognitive ability, of thinking and reasoning skills, for example. If we just go back to intelligence testing, there are some people attempting, there are some psychologists attempting to do it online through use of iPad technology and extending the resources you generally use by putting them in front of the screen. However, to have the child engage with that on the other side of the screen, you really need a child who's going to be able to cooperate, going to be able to focus and engage, going to be able to cope with looking at a screen. And we all know we're looking at the screens now, and sometimes people aren't clear, or they might freeze or whatever. So how safe that is, and how sort of confident your conclusions could be if you're working in that way are questionable. But certainly for the clients that we see, for that child to be able to engage in that way is most unlikely. A lot of the children that I see, I would need to be there making very skilled and finite judgments as we move through that process of cognitive assessment. But setting that aside, there's a lot of other things that you can do. So at the moment, I'm involved with assessing a few children, and the way I'm doing it is by having really good consultation with the parents, by asking them to send me video footage and being quite specific about the things that are going to be helpful for me to see, by having a video conference with the child on the other side. And that includes watching them doing some work with the parents, so I can actually see when their attention is going, or when they're becoming emotionally dysregulated because they're finding things difficult and they're wanting to disengage. And then supplementing that with some very good online questionnaires that are out there, which can look at things like executive functional skills, adaptive skills, or if you like, everyday life skills, etc. So you can bring information together from different points of reference and combine that with the information that's already there through previous reports. And that, in many cases, is enough for you to get a pretty good picture, so you can start to get a report together of some kind, on the basis that you can say to the parents, well, I will supplement this, and when we come out the other side of this, by doing some direct work, etc. But there's enough information here for me to get a pretty confident picture of what issues your child is facing and what is going to help them. And certainly for that initial step where you're talking about convincing people for the need for a statutory assessment, is often enough to be able to present that case, because you get a surprising breadth of information by using all of those different techniques.
How really can you compare, though, an assessment of a child in this situ in school over an assessment of them in isolation? I mean, how can you, Cassandra asks, for example, how much weight can realistically be placed on environmental factors if you've not seen the environment?
Well, first of all, some children that we see anyway are at home anyway because they've fallen out of school for a variety of reasons by not being able to cope with the environment that the school is presenting to them. So we're quite used to seeing children in that context. But if they are in school, it is really important to see them in that context if we can do so. And our first choice is usually to go to the school to start the assessment off in that way.
Chris, I mean, what's your thoughts on this? I mean, a lawyer actually wrote in to me and said, many experts are frequently criticised for merely reporting what the patient had said. And that's really just a factual recount, and the perception may of course be wrong. How really can that be held up as a quality assessment in comparison with one that that's assessed all of those factors? Do you see this as a problem that's likely to be spilt over into the tribunal system when you're trying to persuade tribunals over this?
I mean, I think certainly tribunals are going to have to consider that issue and to look at the weight that can be given to expert reports and expert evidence that's being given by any professional in circumstances where they've not had what may be the best opportunity to assess a child, which would be in person and in their educational setting. But I think, as Viv says, there are already and have always been situations where children have to be assessed in less than ideal circumstances because they're out of school. And obviously some situations are always hypothetical when you're looking at secondary transfer placements where children aren't going to be in the school they're going to be looking at for the following year. So there always have to be and have always had to be situations where professionals of all fields have had to carry out judgments and to make the best judgment they can based on the evidence that's available. And that's still the situation now. And so what will be important for the tribunal will obviously be for professionals to be making clear what the limitations may be on their assessments and what they have been able to do or not do, and what that may and how that may impact on their conclusions, and be very clear as to where nonetheless they are able to draw conclusions that they feel are valid and supported by the evidence that they've gathered. But obviously it's going to be very much specific to the individual assessment and circumstances, and the tribunal will have to evaluate that concretely each time it comes up.
Charlotte, do you agree with Chris on that? I mean, do you see that it's all very well perhaps to assess a child who might be typically at home or ordinarily at home, but a child who is, let's say, struggling with a school environment because it's too overwhelming, too sensory stimulating, and an expert that assesses and tries to recount that in a tribunal is unable yet, because of the lockdown, to have evaluated that situation. Do you see that as being a real problem in a different context when you're looking in a class, at a child in the classroom context, and that's the whole focus of the tribunal's consideration? Do you see that as a number of people have asked this question?
Well, I can see why, because the culture in the tribunal up until these very exceptional circumstances that we're living in has been that the expert should see certainly the expert should see the child. So, you know, if you have a situation in tribunal, as you sometimes do, where one expert has seen and assessed a child in person and the other expert just hasn't seen them and is writing a report based on documentary evidence around them, then the expert who's seen the child and assessed them in person is always going to have the edge over the witness who hasn't. So the culture is very much up until now that experts have seen children in person. I don't think it is necessarily the case that an online assessment isn't going to be as good as seeing the child in person. I think it's really going to depend on the circumstances, the individual child, the difficulties that they have, and what the evidence is. I mean, firstly, in terms of whether you can do an online assessment, that's I think a call for the experts, guided by whatever regulator they're working with. So all experts who give evidence in the tribunal will be regulated by a professional regulator, and those regulators are giving guidelines, guidance and advice to their members about the circumstances in which you can and can't do things online, and what you can do online and what you have to do in person. So the starting point is, if the expert's professional body says that those assessments can be carried out online, then they can. It's a valid assessment. I think where potentially difficulties might arise is if you have a mismatch of what experts have been able to do. So if you've got a situation where one expert has been able to see and assess the child in person, face to face, in the same room, working with them in that way, and another expert perhaps has come in a bit later on after lockdown has come on and has done those assessments, or whatever assessments they're doing online, that potentially might introduce some mismatches between what each expert has been able to see. Particularly perhaps if one expert has been able to see that child in the classroom and the other hasn't. But at the same time, the tribunal is working in unusual circumstances. It's not the situation that we used to encounter where one party perhaps had been a little bit slow off the mark in terms of instructing an expert, and that's why they'd encountered difficulties with seeing the child. I think the tribunal has to keep an open mind, and I think it can be trusted to keep an open mind in terms of looking at all of the circumstances in light of the situation that we're in, and in terms of looking at the other evidence around that child. So, for example, if it's a situation where you have a child who is really struggling at school because of anxiety or sensory overload, there is likely to be, you would hope, some documentary evidence of that coming out from the school, perhaps from GP referrals or referrals to other professionals whilst that child still was in the school setting. That's all evidence that can be used. I mean, let's not forget that you do sometimes get a situation where the expert goes in to assess a child who has very high anxiety, and then the child happens to be having a good day, and the expert may not see those behaviours when they go in to assess. So the first thing is, there will be other evidence that you can look to for information about how that child is dealing with school, even if the child isn't at school at the moment. And the second thing is that obviously a lot of what I know, all three experts in this webinar now have seen a lot of children where actually their anxiety just doesn't come out at school, or their challenging behaviour doesn't come out at school. It's all held in and it comes out at home. So I think, without meaning to be wishy-washy about it, I think yes, there is potential for this to be there is potential for individual problems to come up in individual cases if there's a mismatch in evidence. But at the same time, we do have the benefit of, obviously we work with very good experts, and we work with a professional tribunal where at least one member of the panel will have personal experience of working with children with special educational needs who are used to looking at documentary evidence without being there themselves. So some difficulties along the way, I think, but not necessarily a completely bleak picture.
David, do you agree with that? Do you think that what Charlotte and Chris have said, do you think that's a fair overview of the benefits and burdens of assessments during this time?
Yes, put simply. So one, I think they've covered a lot of the ground. Taking therefore, just a slightly different take on similar point. There's just been an amendment made to the rules in the normal civil courts, the county court and the high court, about how witness statements are signed off. And one of the amendments that they have made is that you have to explain how the statement was taken. If it was taken in person or by telephone, if it was taken with an interpreter, and so on. And that is, it's one of those amendments, once you hear it, it seems so obvious that it should always have been the case that that information was led, because it tells a lot about how the statement was taken. And it's actually, it sounds like, of course, you hear that and you think, oh, well, obviously the best way of doing it is to do it in person without needing an interpreter, because you're all working in the same language and you're both fluent in it. So all the nuance is open to both of you. But actually, that isn't necessarily the case. It's more about providing clear information. So I think when reports and assessments are being carried out now, it would be a good idea to have a brief passage in explaining what happened and why. I did this assessment in the following way. I did it because whatever that would be, it was needed for a certain time, and I think it had the following effects on the quality of the evidence. And realistically, there likely depends, of course, on what you're doing and why, but it's likely to be some disadvantages in that or at least we all believe there will be, because we just intrinsically we've got used to believing in interaction with people as being, you know, a video call is better than a phone call, and being in person is better than a video call generally. But it won't only be disadvantages, there may be advantages, but so I would say have a paragraph or more in just making all this express, acknowledging it and dealing with it, and then it gets rid of someone sort of thinking they can have an aha moment by challenging you about it.
Well, Serena and Katie have asked the question, is it possible for an education healthcare assessment to be done without seeing the child and just simply going off reports? And Katie said that she got to the point where her child got to panel stage, just about to issue a plan, but she doesn't really know where she stands now because the local authority have not gotten back to her. So, I mean, in relation to the first point, there is provision, of course, in Regulation 6, subsection 4, as I recall, for an assessment from, let's say, an educational psychologist, not necessarily to be necessary if someone else assessed previously and there's an agreement between all the parties. I mean, do you see that maybe that the local authority, David, do you think that the local authorities might start invoking that and agreeing those kind of things at this stage?
I think it would be difficult to see how an assessment would be done without seeing the child, because there's such a wide range of sources of evidence you can draw on. And actually often the person who is putting together the assessment overall isn't particularly coming from using their own expertise or their own experience of education to put the document together. And it's likely that you will have some material in there from people who actually know the child quite well, e.g. the child's school. So it's unlikely it will ever be that the person carrying out the assessment, generally, they don't actually, well, Mike, you'll know better than me, but they don't really see the child, the person who actually is giving you the result of the assessment, collating it and making the judgment. They're generally going on the back of assessments from the school, from an educational psychologist, speech therapist, occupational therapist.
I think you're thinking of Tracy's question, are you, Dave? I mean, Tracy says, how really can a caseworker, a local authority case officer, when she has all these reports, try and balance what out of the reports we accept and what we don't? And we often see, don't we, that the trend seems to be that if you're an independent expert and you're speaking as someone who's got a vested interest in the outcome, really, that's what they seem to be criticizing you. Only the local authority experts are the only ones we'll ever listen to, and that's what really Tracy's picking up on. She's saying, well, how on earth is a caseworker qualified to pick out what's in what are the problems and the strengths and the weaknesses in a particular expert's report? Juanita, do you find that very frustrating when you're producing a report?
Well, clearly, you know, it happens. I mean, that's often what gets us all into the situation that the majority of us work within. But again, I think it goes back to the quality of the assessment information that you're providing, and the importance of going through very systematically and comprehensively all previous assessment information. So there's bound to have been at some point, say in my case, a speech and language assessment before I've got to that child. So I then will look at the core areas of similarity and make that point and emphasize it, so that it's not simply me saying this as the independent brought in, it's actually been raised before by the speech and language therapist who may have undertaken the assessment to inform the EHC plan. So it's just being very careful about the information, making sure that you go through it and picking out those really key points.
I mean, in my experience, I'm sure my fellow lawyers will agree with me that you rarely have much of a chance of succeeding in a tribunal action, and I think particularly in this time, without you're obtaining your own expert reports, because you often see a trend of local authority reports being rather vague in comparison with reports that might be produced from the private sector being much more specific. I'm sure my fellow lawyers colleagues will agree with that. Charlotte, have you got any thoughts on that or points that you want to reinforce?
I feel like I should say, as a matter of principle, that you do sometimes come across very good local authority reports, and you sometimes come across independent reports that are less detailed than you'd like. But yes, I think I think that's right. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because as people, in a way, lawyers, I think, are almost analogous to those officers, because we're also a lot of the time looking at working documents and thinking about what we should put in them from the reports. And it is sometimes the case that when you sit down with your experts at the start of the hearing or in conference beforehand and say, oh, well, I thought this was particularly key because of this, or I think this doesn't matter because of that. It's not unheard of that your expert will say, well, no, actually, that is really important, and it's important because of X, Y, and Z. So yes, there is this weird disconnect where all of this sort of quite technical information goes to somebody who, however intelligent and receptive they are, may just not be very good at identifying the bits that are relevant because they don't have that expertise.
It's funny, it's an irony. I remember representing a psychologist not that long ago who had been working previously in the public sector, who since representing her own child was criticising the reports because she said, "Oh, that's not strong. That's not specific enough." That's it, isn't it? That's just a painful irony, I suppose. With some. I mean, Juanita, Rochelle has asked. She says, in the current climate, I'm not quite sure how this is COVID-19 related, but I suspect that maybe what's happening is that in her home program there was supposed to be some speech therapy intervention, or maybe in the school program, and what she's saying is that. The educational psychologist has said, well, they can train the staff on speech and language therapy interventions. Do you think that's I mean, maybe Vivian or you can answer that. The educational psychologist is training staff on speech therapy.
Well, I would probably have a slight issue with that. I think that there would be a certain amount of information and training that the educational psychologist would be able to provide, because we know that EPs look at language in their overview assessment of a child. But I think that it's vitally important that you have a speech and language therapist involved in training staff, delivering programs, because that's the skill base of the therapist. And I often see myself in lots of reports that, there will be training for staff, and it's never clear who might deliver that training, and sometimes trying to get agreement that it would be a speech and language therapist is very difficult, because quite often when looking at the intervention from a therapist, the focus is always on the direct provision for the child. But the indirect provision is equally as important and gets lost. And that's where the training comes into it. So it's, again, crucial that the therapist ensures that the training program that they want staff to follow, because after all, we're then asking staff to deliver this provision to the child or young person, it is exactly what they need it to be. And that's, again, crucial. Our professional bodies are very strong on that point. We, as therapists, have to be confident that the people that we're asking to run the programs can do exactly that. Otherwise, our programs aren't really doing what they should be.
Yeah. Agnieszka has raised an interesting point. She says that her school is refusing to allow therapists online appointments due to safeguarding issues. Melinda, have you experienced that in the work that you say you'll be doing remotely at the moment?
I can't understand why they would be refusing that. I've got a lot of criteria that I go through with parents beforehand, so parents have to be present for the entire time that I'm with their child on a screen, and they know beforehand that if they're not on the screen and visible, then I won't proceed with the assessment. But no, I can't, from my perspective, because the parent's instructing me and they're present, I don't see it as a safeguarding issue.
Viv, have you experienced any of that as a problem? If there was problems at all in the work that you're doing?
Not in terms of trying to use video conferencing with the school, because as yet I haven't done that. I've maintained telephone contact when I need to talk to teachers. But in the past, I have occasionally had a school that's not wanted me to go in and have used a number of different excuses as to why they wouldn't want someone coming into the school, which we normally get around in the end. So I suppose I haven't had too much of that, but then I haven't really tried to deliver any kind of intervention as such using video conferencing and or with the school. But having been through this situation, etc., it's not to say that I won't be trying to use it more in the future, particularly at the consultation stage when you're talking to parents or teachers. I think it's shown itself to be pretty good.
Chris, do you think that the school in that instance has got a reasonable legal argument?
Obviously, it will be somewhat fact specific, but I think as a general point, it's not going to be enough simply to say all video conferencing is inherently unsafe. I think we've probably all seen some stories of odd occasions, at least, where some platforms and video conferencing has apparently had issues with being hacked, or at least other people coming in and people who aren't supposed to be on calls being able to get into them in different ways. Obviously, for any school or any provider that's delivering things in that way, there needs to be some assessment of the security that can be achieved. But all of these platforms are designed to have elements of security and password protection and other things that can be put in place. So it's not possible just to get in remotely to a one-on-one call. And I think that's really the question for a school in those circumstances is going to be, well, what have you done to assess what can be put in place by way of video conferencing facility, and what risk assessments have they done, and what alternatives have they explored to try and find a way of achieving that, if that's the only option which is going to be available, compared to the child gets nothing at all. So I think if that's the situation with any school taking that line, then it's certainly something that needs to be explored further with them, but it may well be open to challenge if they're just throwing the word safeguarding out there and not doing any more than that.
Does anyone have any views about answering, for example, Corinne's point? She says that she asked if she can ask for her child to go back a school year. She said because her child in that instance has been deeply traumatized and is not ready for transition. I mean, I'm not sure whether the question was, again, I think it sounds more specific to that particular instance, or whether she says, does she need an expert who specializes in post-16 work, because her child, of course, is at that stage in life. And Viv, you've done a lot of post-16 provision for young people who are moving on. I mean, I think we dealt with the big cases on it in the olden days. Do you remember in the
Yeah. No, it's an interesting question, and I think all that can be said is it will be very much an individual case as to what the issues are and why that's being put forward as the best possible solution. But in general, what we might refer to as back classing, if you like, schools may suggest that because they don't think the child's going to cope with the next year group, or it would be useful for them to catch up. But actually the research in that area is quite dubious about the benefits of that, and suggests that there can be disadvantages about taking that course of action. So in sort of most cases, I would look very carefully at that. But here we're dealing with an older child or young person. We don't know quite why that's being suggested. So it would just need to be looked at on an individual basis and not taken as a good answer per se. if the child's having difficulty with moving on. And if there are issues about moving on, then perhaps that needs to be looked at carefully, because there may be other solutions to think about as well.
I mean, do you think though that, I mean, maybe I'll let this open to anyone to answer, but I mean, do you think that this lockdown period is going to lead to a number of people making this kind of request for, you know, this year has been pretty much wasted perhaps, and we want to redo the year again? I know I've had a number of people calling me and asking for a request be made in the education healthcare plan for the child to go back a year, because so much has been lost. I mean, not least due to the fact that in the current climate, a lot of children are very traumatized by what they're seeing on the news. I mean, these terrible, terrible stories every day about death all around us. It's traumatic for all of us, never mind children who are very, very sensitive. Do you think that that's going to be a trend? Do you think that there'll be more and more requests made for the year to be done again? Anyone?
I'll take that one. I mean, there may be some. I think we just need to be realistic. At the moment, children have missed 3 weeks of school. They're potentially going to miss another 3 weeks and hopefully go back. So we need to sort of give a balanced view on that. And they are being provided with education in the meantime.
But I'm not sure it's 3 weeks, Viv. That's the thing. I mean,
Have I got that wrong?
No, it has been 3 weeks. That's right.
Yeah.
The lockdown has been 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Quite right about that. But the trauma and the social distancing advice has been in play for quite some time, and it's likely to be in play for a considerable period of time moving forward, isn't it? I mean, there's 3 more weeks of lockdown, then there's going to be more weeks ahead of that where we're almost certainly going to have to still stick to social distancing rules.
Well, that is a bit of the unknown as to where will this lead. But one bit of advice I would suggest is to manage how much your children actually do watch the TV coverage, etc. I mean, it is on the whole time, it's incessant, and they go over and over things. And depending on your age and developmental level of the child, you need to manage how much they are exposed to in that, and turn off the news as well. Let them ask
hard
questions.
to escape it though. It's hard to escape it. It's on the internet.
Let them ask questions and answer them according to their age, etc. And go through what is happening and the ways to keep themselves safe. Talk about the positive things that are coming out of this, and try to deflect some of that worry. It's just trying to manage this for your child to help them not feel overwhelmed by it all.
The point that we were going on to discuss, I mean, one of the other points that has been made about this lockdown is how this might affect the number of assessments that a child might need, or whether or not even the incidents now that we've been talking about when people are actually home and they're educating their children. We talked about it at the beginning, if you remember. I mean, Bridget says, for example, how often should an educational psychologist be reviewing a child's progress at this time?
Or at any time.
At any time. I mean, I think the point that she's making is how frequently should it be ordinarily, and how frequently should it be in this particular period? I think that's the point that she's making.
And again, it will depend on the child. If the child is one where changes are being seen, changes in anxiety or their emotional presentation, what they seem able to do, whether the parents are observing regression in work, etc., then yes, an educational psychology review would be enormously helpful. Other children will not need that to happen. And again, it depends on the complexity and needs of the child. A child who might have an education, health and care plan, for example, you would want to expect it, or you'd want to see an educational psychology input on a fairly regular basis. The reality of that is it's probably not going to happen unless there are some really quite urgent issues to be dealt with. People often talk about a review every 2 years or an update every 2 years, particularly if you're talking about children who might need exam concessions, etc., and they need an up-to-date report. And people often say when the child is approaching a transition, so moving from one phase of school to another phase of school, that's also an important time to get an educational psychology review of some kind. But if your child is starting to show changes or difficulties, perhaps the presentation of their needs are altering, then that would be another reason to request an educational psychology review.
Would you say the same about occupational therapy assessments, Melinda, and this?
During this time, I think that if we go back to the foundations of OT, it's all about, are there functional difficulties? So if your child does have functional difficulties, or if, as Viv said, if they seem to be regressing, then absolutely, you may need to prioritise what has to come first, because we don't want to overwhelm children, but it's more than possible to do an OT assessment, and an enormous amount of information comes from parents. I think Charlotte referred earlier, an enormous amount of information comes from the school, and most schools do have some of their staff still there. Even over the Easter break, I've been liaising when normally we can't talk to schools during the Easter break. Schools also have a lot of photographic and video footage, so as long as there's not other children in that footage, then that can be incredibly helpful of seeing the difficulties or the strengths the child had in the school environment. So just by thinking creatively, I think that we really can get around so many of the barriers.
Yeah. I mean, there's going to be a number of things that, the effects, if you like, that this is going to have on the tribunal system and generally complying with education healthcare plans. I mean, I know that in the first week of lockdown, it was obviously quite quiet. It's been, I don't know whether my colleagues have also noticed this, but the number of calls that we've had and I've had has been unprecedented in the last few days. There's not a lot of activity in the local authority camp at the moment. There's a lot of apprehension in relation to what's going to happen in September. You know, we touched upon a lot of those points earlier. And people are not getting decisions quickly enough, and you can see that the practical ramifications this is having, because particularly on children or young people who are at a point of transition, they're not able to evaluate the alternative school placements that may be on offer, moving from primary to secondary, moving from secondary to college, moving from college to university, and so on. There's real apprehension. I mean, David, do you see this as something that the law really can do? Do you think local authorities are going to be held more to account in the next few weeks to try and comply with these more vigorous deadlines, or do you think they're just going to simply make the COVID-19 defense and say, look, we can't? And how's that going to affect children and young people at this very critical point of transition?
So I'm afraid I think it's really hard to predict. I mean, we are only 3 weeks in. There has been a huge effort. I mean, the rate of change in the first days and week or so in the system, in the tribunal and court system, from moving towards other ways of doing that final stage of the process, that is hearing contested cases, was phenomenal. But quite how that's going to bed down, because it's ultimately that's where people will be forced to deal with things. Quite how that's going to bed down, we just don't know yet. They are now, there was a time when they stopped doing hearings, they're now getting back to doing hearings by video link. And we'll just have to see how much people like that, how much it takes hold, if they get a smooth system going. I think it's hard to know what the effect is going to be on things happening next year, how much tolerance people develop for things falling off, or how much people are held to the same standards. I think it's very hard to know, I'm afraid. I know I'd love to be able to give people, you know, I know the uncertainty is difficult, but I'd love to be able to give people an answer. But what's going to happen come September, how they'll deal with secondary transfer in the next few months, watch this space.
Juanita, Tracy has written in on, and we've got so many questions. It's a shame I'm not going to be able to go through all of them, I'm afraid. There's over 300 questions we've had. But she says she has 3 children aged 9 in a specialist placement, I think it means, with who says I have 3 children aged 9 with autism and aged 9 and 10. Oh, 9 and 7. Sorry, I think there's a typo. And they've been supported. She said, I've noticed that my 13-year-old needs a lot of help with the large amount of work that's been set by the school. It's just me, she says, at home in the day. How on earth can I possibly spread myself without feeling guilty, not giving a homeschool education along with dealing with behaviours, anxiety and stress? I mean, this is what people are facing every day, aren't they, these days?
Absolutely. And, you know, nobody's asked for this. You know, parents aren't teachers, or that they're not all lucky enough to have, you know, had teaching as their profession. And I don't think that they should be feeling guilty. They've got to do the best that they can in the most extraordinary of circumstances. And trying to homeschool 3 children with special educational needs, that is no mean feat. And from the sounds of the question, they're all at different stages. And so there aren't going to be things that can be done together. But perhaps, you know, there might be some activities, some learning activities that they can all work on together. It's going to be a case of just looking to see what they are, taking each child's needs into consideration, because I would have thought that there are going to be differences in terms of how long they can attend to tasks. So it might be that, you know, we use a little bit of screen time with 1 or 2 children whilst we're doing some one-on-one work with a particular child and switching things round. I mean, you know, I can only but imagine how challenging it is. And of course, you know, for those parents who are supporting children with autism, well, the children with autism don't see their parents as teachers. They're their parents. So that's another massive issue. And we know that even when schools are up and running, one of the biggest concerns that we hear from parents time and time again is that when their children are at home, they don't want to engage in tasks that they see as learning tasks. They don't want to do homework. They don't want to do extended pieces of writing because they see that as being schoolwork. So I think, again, really careful discussions have to be had with children as to why we're working in these circumstances. Again, I know that I was on a website the other day and I saw a beautiful social story about COVID-19 and what that means and the various changes. I think that, you know, those sorts of resources are absolutely crucial for parents to access and use. So just as Viv and Melinda have suggested, I will provide a link at the end of this so that parents out there can download and use some of those free resources.
Thank you. And as you notice, you'll see quite a lot of questions that come in on Zoom. I'm not sure whether all panelists can see those questions on the Q&A. If you click it, you'll see it. But there's a number of questions that have been raised about the kind of things. Where can I get more information about the resources and the assessment tools that you can use during this period? That's been raised quite a number of times. I mean, one of the things, Charlotte, I was wondering what your thoughts might be about, I mean, taking some of these examples that we're seeing of children who and young people who are at home at the moment, get isolated and becoming rather aggressive toward their parents. I mean, Juanita talked about it on you know, they see their parents as parents, not their teachers, and they react adversely to when a parent is trying to get them to do something they don't, schoolwork wise. And I know that I've had a number of calls this week, sadly, from parents who are just simply desperate, and they're talking about they can't cope another day with their child because in school they're getting 2-to-1 support, and at home it's just mum. And mum, in this instance, has been very badly bashed by the child. And what can she do? Do you see, what advice can you give that mum?
Well, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, that is a terrible situation to be in. It's absolutely agonizing to be a parent who is being assaulted by your child to the point where, you know, to the point where you are having to choose between your parenting and your own safety and possibly other younger children who are in the family home, family life generally. I mean, my heart really goes out to anybody who is in that position. First tier tribunal, I don't know if this is a situation, you know, if we're talking about a situation where there is an appeal ongoing in the first tier tribunal to get some sort of provision like a residential placement or a long residential placement, a 52-week residential placement or something along those lines. The sad answer is that mechanisms for getting the first tier tribunal to hear a case quickly on that basis have been limited. And the reason for that, in part, to be fair to the tribunal, is that I think when these cases come in, they do triage them to some extent and they identify the cases that are challenging. I actually have a very similar case on my caseload at the moment. And when we had our telephone case management hearing, obviously we wanted the hearing as soon as possible because of the extreme circumstances that the family were in. And the tribunal's view on that was simply, well, yes, but we have many cases that are like this that are just as compelling. And you know, they cannot expedite all of them, which is obviously, you can see it administratively from the tribunal's point of view, but that's no comfort at all to the parent who's actually living in that situation day to day. In terms of mechanisms outside of tribunal proceedings, there are, you can get social care involved, you can ask for respite arrangements, you can ask for care at home. If the situation is so extreme that you are doubting that you are going to be able to continue to accommodate the child. And I do want to say that's something that parents understandably agonize over, but it is sometimes necessary. I think a lot of parents struggle with it because they say to themselves that making that kind of decision is kind of fundamentally contrary to the unconditional love that a parent has for their child. But I think everybody here would agree that it's not. There are often situations where it is the best thing for everybody concerned if that child or young person is accommodated somewhere or with people who have the expertise and qualifications to do it. So there is the option of the Section 20 process under the Children Act, which we all know about, where you can say to the local authority, look, I'm sorry, but I cannot accommodate my child anymore. I need you to do it. And the local authority has to act on that. The concern that parents often have is that that is a prelude to care proceedings. The answer is that it shouldn't be of itself. I think it's a big decision that shouldn't be taken lightly. It's always going to depend on the circumstances. It is one of those decisions where I would say if you can get legal advice about it, you really should. But there are things that parents in that situation can do if they are in a day-to-day living situation that is intolerable and putting other members of the family in emotional or physical danger.
Thank you. Chris, has there been any changes since we did the presentation back 2 weeks ago over the Coronavirus Act and the suspension or relaxation of social care responsibilities? I know I saw something on social media the other day that someone was talking about it, QC in London was talking about the concerns over adult care support. Has there been, can you tell the audience whether there's been any changes since the presentation you gave last?
Not that I'm aware of, in terms of making formal directions or making any of the changes to the law more formal than they were before. And so the position is, I think, largely the same in that there's not been more formal legal changes. The practical issues which we've been discussing and discussed before still obviously are going to remain. One change to the law following on from what Charlotte was just discussing that was made very recently was to change the tribunal rules in relation to hearings and to allow for them to make decisions without holding a hearing in urgent cases. That's not something that I'm aware of actually having been done yet, but it's a potential in an urgent situation, if it's not reasonably practical to hold a hearing, and as long as it's in the interest of justice to do so, the tribunal can now make a decision without holding a hearing, including final decisions. Whether that's something that anyone would want to take up, because obviously it deprives the tribunal of hearing oral evidence and an argument, but in a very urgent case, it may be at least an option to consider putting to the tribunal and saying, well, this is urgent and needs to be dealt with in that way.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we're coming to the stage where we're coming to the end of the presentation, but I just thought it'd be quite nice if everyone wanted to give a little snapshot summary of the advice, the best advice they can give to those who are watching from their perspective, from their expert perspective. So we'll start with you, Viv. Just a very short summary of the best advice you can give to parents in these circumstances at the moment.
I think the one thing I'd like to say is to remember what learning is all about. And if you've got a school that are just giving you lots of worksheets, etc., and that doesn't suit your child's style of learning, or you're struggling every day to get your child to engage and it's causing issues, then step back and think about what learning is all about. Some children need lots of visual input. Some children need to be out and doing things, learning practically. Other children will be able to cope with worksheets and textbooks and things like that. One of the links that we're putting out is a resource put out by the government for this situation. It is full of web links which take you to different kinds of resources. There are things now where you can get sort of video cams into zoos and museums. Audiobooks for children are free during this period, so they can listen to stories rather than have to read. There are lots of things that you can do as families or as one parent with a child, which may be about things you do on a day-to-day basis to work together as a family unit. And that is all about learning. And also what we're dealing with is a very unique situation which you're managing with on a day-to-day basis. You are learning how to deal with that, with a sort of a situation where the world has been turned upside down, and you're dealing with it and you're coping with it, so you can celebrate that. That is all about learning. So don't worry too much about the worksheets if your child really cannot do them.
Thank you, Viv. Chris, anything that you want to say in a very short summary of the best advice you think you can give at the moment in the present circumstances?
I mean, I think the best advice any lawyer gives is usually it depends, and in any situation there's going to be a need to look at the particular circumstances the child is in, and obviously it's an exceptional situation, and that does make even legal prediction even more difficult in most situations. But what it doesn't mean, and what hasn't happened either legally or as a practical matter, is that local authorities now have what you call the COVID-19 defence of just saying COVID-19, we don't have to do anything, or we don't have to do X, Y, or Z. Their duties are still there. Enforcing them may not be as easy as it used to be, and there may be arguments open about exceptionality, but it's still something that we can look into and advise on, and it would be sensible in a lot of situations to seek legal advice if children really aren't coping, and if things aren't being provided which were or which are needed. And there may still be challenges that can be brought, and how the court will deal with those remains, as David says, something unfortunately to be seen in some respects, but the legal basis for them is still there.
Lovely, thank you, Chris. David, what's your best advice you think you can give the audience today, from your perspective, the key thing that you want to convey?
Do you know what, I'm going to, I think, give people a sort of little moment of hope. So not quite advice as such, but I think one of the things that has really affected services provided by local authorities in the last 10 years has been austerity. And the reality is they have just very much less money than they had 10 years ago. And there is perhaps a chance that people will begin again to see the importance of these services now. And they're in some ways, they're in a slightly better position than they were because they've been given a bit more money. And what will make a big difference to everything, we can do all the detail, but the really big picture thing would be just a slightly more realistic budget for local authorities. And maybe, just maybe, that will be one of the results of when we come through the other side of the coronavirus.
Thank you very much, David. Melinda, what's the best advice from your perspective?
Well, I think as an OT, we always think functionally and we follow child's development. So if you've got younger children or any age who may be struggling with doing their work, just remember that learning, as Viv says, happens in many ways. So for younger children, learning through play, for older children, baking, doing the gardening. There's a lot of learning that goes on in those sorts of tasks, and really importantly, connecting with your child. Don't be so concerned that they're going to fall behind, because everybody is going to go back at different stages. We don't want to send kids back anxious and upset that they're going to be behind their peers. We want to send them back looking forward to going back to school if that's possible. And one thing I tell all the parents I work with, just please don't read every resource on the internet. There is far too many resources. Find sites that you connect with, get some advice, talk to one particular person if you're talking to a therapist or an advisor, but just don't be overwhelmed.
Thank you, Melinda. Charlotte, what's the best tip from your perspective? I mean, I know you've talked twice on 2 seminars before, then you probably may have even said it before, but for those who may not have heard you before, so if you could just give us a quick summary.
Well, actually, I wanted to do the same thing that David did, funnily enough, and just sort of put a note of positivity out there, because as Chris said, I think what most lawyers tend to say is, number one, it varies from individual to individual, and number two, if you can get legal advice, you probably should. So what I wanted to say specifically is that actually the early indications that we're seeing, certainly in the tribunal process, are really positive. The tribunal has engaged with remote hearings. It is hearing remote hearings very successfully. The tech is fairly well set up. We are narrowing issues much more effectively in first-tier tribunals, ironically, than we were when we were doing them face-to-face. They're finishing on time. Very few of them are getting adjourned in the way that perhaps some parents will be familiar with prior to lockdown occurring. And in fact, as I understand it, they now have surplus judicial resource because of the other bits of the first-tier tribunal that aren't sitting. And so they're now saying to some parents, we might be able to hear your case earlier. So you might be able to bring your case forward earlier, although I don't know how that will pan out in practice. So far, the first-tier tribunal appears to have adapted really well. And I think that across the board in every area, people are just getting a bit more used to remote working, a bit more used to doing things like this via video conference instead of face-to-face. So whereas at the moment we might see people saying, you can't have that assessment because it can't be done online, I think as this process continues, we will see people starting to unbend from that just naturally. So I think that there are some positives to come out of this. And I think there's cause for general optimism.
Well, that's very, very good to hear. We don't get that from the news these days, but
No, I suppose not.
Juanita, over to you. Your best tip for the parents at the moment.
I mean, it's largely been said. I mean, communication doesn't occur in a vacuum. So regardless of where we are, where your child is, we are going to be practicing communication skills. And I think the current situation just gives us a different way, perhaps, of looking at the way in which we're interacting with our children as a unit, with our local communities. I see lots of young children out and about when I go on my exercise, and I certainly hear them communicating about what they're seeing, and they're engaging in a different way. So I think that's one of these great positives. Where the role of a speech and language therapist is concerned in the whole tribunal process, therapists are coming up to speed with the technology. We are at a position whereby we can undertake a certain amount of assessment. Again, it's going to vary dependent upon the needs, the individual needs of the child or young person that has been referred, but we can certainly do some of that work. So we're trying to avoid a scenario whereby suddenly, once lockdown's over, there's this sort of overwhelming rush. You know, the hope is that we will continue to see children very steadily, but there will be some that we need to go in and observe in school once this situation is over.
Thank you very much, Juanita. What would I say? I mean, well, firstly, I think I want to answer many of the questions that have come through, but I mean, Sue has said She's terribly worried. Her local authority has been trying to force her child into the wrong place, she says, plainly unsuitable. She missed the deadline to reply to the proposed education healthcare plan, or maybe it was even a statement. It's not clear whether it's a statement or an education healthcare plan. My advice to you, Sue, is that don't worry, because you still have 2 months within which to appeal. And if you have missed the moment to make representations at the draft stage, you still can do that. And if you're in Wales, you can invoke the provisions of the dispute resolution processes of the Education Act and ask the local authority to mediate, if you like. And if you are, of course, in England and you're dealing with an education healthcare plan, you can ask the local authority again to mediation, and that will give you an additional bit more time in the case of England, not in Wales, but in the case of England, to give you a bit more time within which to appeal. So there is an opportunity still ahead of you to try and make that and to resolve that, and to plainly try and mediate. And also to Lisa, she asks if there are different rules that apply in England as they do in Wales. There are different rules that apply in Wales. In Wales, the provision that the rules are pretty much the rules that they used to be in England, and the regulations are still the old regulations, if you like, that were previously applying in England. And that, of course, deals with statementing, and statement appeals goes to the Special Education Needs Tribunal in Wales. And they are still, the Welsh Tribunal are operating under the same rules that govern the English tribunal system, in this COVID-19 episode at the moment. That's what I mean by that. There are different rules in terms of the tribunal procedure, because they are different in Wales as they are in England, but the remote access to the tribunal is still the same. I mean, there's been so many questions, and I so wish I had had enough time to answer the enormous amount of questions. And I think what has probably made me think that perhaps what we might do as a legal team is pre-record the answers to many questions, and maybe I'll post it on our website and on Facebook, because we just simply haven't had enough time to go through the amount of questions that have been asked, and I'm very sorry about that. But what I will say, if I can ask my guests who are in from Viv and Melinda and Juanita, if they could perhaps drop me an email with the resources that they were talking about, that we can display on our website, so that people can access those resources, I'd be very, very grateful. And I know that Dan, who's our technical support officer, will do his best to put those resources up on our website after this presentation. I mean, there are a number of resources available on our website, which will be on immediately after this webinar concludes, and that will deal with home learning resources, the resources that parents can access, and support and guidance on school closures, and supporting particular issues and audiobooks, etc. And that advice will be available. I mean, I do sincerely hope that you enjoyed the Sinclair's Law webinar. I've really enjoyed presenting it today, the Special Needs Masterclass. A recording has been taken, and this recording will stay on the Facebook site, and will also be available on YouTube and on the Sinclair's Law site for those who might have missed it. And please, until then, if you have any questions or any queries at all, or you're worried about something, your case is urgent, please understand the courts are still there, they're still operating. The tribunal system, we've heard, is still operating. We've heard a lot of positive things from everyone really today about the things that you can benefit from in the current circumstances. There's a lot of resources out there. The tribunals are operating and time limits are still running. So please don't be too disillusioned. And for those who are really in a critical situation and desperately in need of help, we are here to help you. Drop us an email. There's a lot of information on our website, www.sinclairslaw.co.uk. It's been a pleasure hosting this seminar this afternoon, and my deepest thanks to all of my guests, Vivian, Melinda, David, Charlotte, Juanita and Chris. Thank you all so very much for joining us this afternoon, and I'd like to wish you all a very warm afternoon, a good afternoon, and also mind the weather here is not so good here in Wales. I'm not sure what it's like. I always ask that question when I'm doing these seminars. What's the weather like over there? What's the weather like with you guys in London? Most of you are in London, I think, aren't you?
Looking very gloomy.
Not good.
Wet.
All right, well, that just brings me to say thank you all so very much for joining us, and I wish you a very good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye everyone. Bye.
Bye.